Where we're at now is the stage where we actually have to set everything up and configure it. Configuring is, you know, the lifeblood of being an administrator for this kind of thing. This is where you're tweaking and setting things up and whatnot. This is what you're going to be looking at more of your time than installing packages. So most of the WeBWorK configuration files are stored in WeBWorK 2 conf. And WeBWorK has a cascading configuration system in the sense that there are files that are run first and they set defaults, and then files that are loaded or run after them can override those defaults. And the basic structure of it is you have defaults.conf, which sets up everything, and then you have localoverrides.conf, which can override defaults.conf. And then you have course.conf, which is something that's specific to each course you're in and can override both of the previous ones. So you can set things up so that certain courses have different configuration settings than other courses. We don't have any courses yet, so we're really looking at defaults.conf and localoverrides.conf. There are some other conf files that we need. So looking at all of these things, notice most of them are dist files. That means we're going to need to copy them over to be non-dist files before we actually have a working version of them. The one we need to focus on right now is site.conf. That has all of our site-specific configuration information. So I'm going to copy site.conf.dist over to site.conf. And then I'm going to edit it, and we're going to see what we need to set in site.conf. So scrolling down, some things we need to set are our server root URL. That is the URL, the public-facing URL of the server that you're currently using. I do not have a DNS name for the server that I had. I just had that IP address, right? So I'm going to go here and copy this IP address. Too much. If you're running a secure server with HTTPS, you need to put HTTPS here. You can change this WeBWorK 2 to be something else. People usually don't. I'm not sure if it all works if you do that. Moving on, this is our server user ID and server group ID. Our server user ID is www.data because that's what our Perl server runs as. But we actually changed the group ID from the default to the www.data group. This means that things created by the server will have the right group for us to actually edit them as the www.admin user. Remember, www.data has both of them in it. Paths to external programs, you shouldn't need to change any of these. Most of them are pretty standard. But if something's failing because it can't find a command that you know is on there, this might be the culprit. So you're seeing the myriad of tools and things that WeBWorK is calling on to do the stuff that it does. Database options. This is where we put information for our database. If you were going to have a database on a different server, for example, you'd put so here. If you were to change the style of the storage engine, you could do so here. Notice these are the things that we have to set. The database username, this is the username that I created in that long MySQL statement, and the database password for that user, which I believe was just password? I don't actually remember. We will find out when the web server starts. I think it was just password, though. Moving on. You should probably leave this stuff default unless you decided to do something different. So it's telling WeBWorK where our various folders and things are. We're not going to change those. Mail settings. These are settings for the SMTP server, the server that actually sends mail. This is something you're going to have to probably talk to your system administrators about, your IT people. Some schools, you can set up this server to be a mail server. Some schools don't like it when you set up local servers to be mail servers because it messes with things, and running a mail server means that you can send spam and things like that. Most of the time your school will already have a mail server set up, but you may need a particular account on it, or you may need a particular permissions or whatnot to use it. So you should get in touch with your school about what your SMTP server is. Sender. This is the address when WeBWorK sends mail. This is who it says it's from. I said main. I should have said mail. This is not going to work anyway because my mail server is behind a VPN, and this is not going to be able to access that VPN. But if you were to set it up, this is what it would look like. Do we have any issues? Okay. So moving on, this is where we installed the OPNL. So that's fine. We're not going to change that. This is something you might want to change. This is the default time zone of your server. You can set time zones individually on a per course basis, but chances are you're going to want to set it for your server and then use that as the default. This is Eastern time, and we are going to keep using Eastern time. This is the locale. Locale, of course, being the language that WeBWorK is in. Currently, the locale is set to EN-US. That's the default English US. We have sporadic support for other locales. If you really want to use WeBWorK and you would really rather WeBWorK be in your local language, get in touch with us. We're happy to help with the localization process, but it is also a semi-long process. You got a lot of translating to do and things like that, but it's set up to be able to handle it pretty easily. So I could change this to FR for French, but I'm not because I don't read French. So I'm going to save that. That's site.conf. Okay. Because of legacy and things, there are conf files we don't need. Like, for example, global.conf.dist isn't used anymore at all. And database.conf.dist is, well, it's used as the dist file. The actual dist file is used, and so you don't need to copy it over to a database.conf file for whatever reason, so we don't have to touch that. The other one we do have to do, though, is local overrides. This is where you're going to have a lot of your local configuration stuff. Local overrides is a big one. This is where you can set a lot of stuff, and actually you can set things that aren't in local overrides. So if you find some configuration variable in defaults.conf that you want to change, you can set that variable in local overrides, and it will override it in defaults to config. So there's a lot going on with local overrides. Additional things that pretty much everything can be set here. For example, additional mail feedback recipients, people who get, mail other than professors. This is a nice one. It's off by default, but you can turn on the upgrade notifier, which will let you know in the course admins page whether or not you have upgrades available for your given, your selected remote and branch. So my remote is origin, that's the original branch, and then master is what I'm pointing at, so we'll keep doing that. Theme, if you want to change your colors, this is where you would do that site-wide. Site info, I actually recommend changing this to a different file. It'll work where its site info is now, but unfortunately site info is going to get overwritten every time you update because it's a file that's tracked and delivered by Git. It should really be siteinfo.dist, and you would copy it over to an actual site info file. So you might set this at some point. Think of this as a tour of the sorts of things that you can change. You can change snippets that show up in top of PG files. You can change stuff about the library. You can change where it's stored. You can add additional buttons so that people can find specific sets of problems. You'll notice what's happened here is big users of WeBWorK have added their own sort of specific versions of what problems they like and use, and so you can browse those. Permission levels. This is where you can change the permissions of various things. This is useful for if you want to change something default, like to allow TAs to actually change student grades. TAs currently are not allowed to change student grades, and if you wanted to enable that, you'd do something messing with stuff here. You know, for example, you're not currently allowed to record answers when you're acting as a student, even if you're a professor. We don't want professors to actually submit answers for students. You can make them do that yourselves, but if you really just want to submit answers for students, and that's something you could do by enabling this permission here. Moving on, display modes. Images and MathJax are the two that people use nowadays, and MathJax is the better of them. Things for macros, PG specific stuff, default stuff when you're creating problems. Some of the things is things you actually want to set in site.conf for a specific course if a professor had specific, you know, ideas. This chooses what versions of the various interfaces you're using. Sometimes you'll notice we're using a particular one and not the ones that have higher numbers. Sometimes the higher number ones are better. Sometimes the higher ones are just different or unfinished. This is useful. Temp files. This is, you do something to change the location of your temporary files. One reason you might do this is because you can install a lighter web server like light HTTPD or light TTP to serve static files that don't need to be generated or things like that, and it can do this much faster than Apache can, and so it'll speed your server up. It's not done by default, but this is where you would set that kind of thing. We're getting to the end, I promise. You can actually see the percentage down at the bottom of the Emacs page if you're really waiting to see how long I'm going to keep going on about this particular file. In this case, we're 86% done, so you have, you know, a few more minutes to look forward to. Authentication. This is something you'll want to change, maybe. You can use WeBWorK's default authentication. It's fine, but a lot of people also want to tie their school's identification into WeBWorK, so that students will have the same password for WeBWorK as you have for your school, and this is where you start doing that kind of stuff. You can set it up so it works with LTI, that's going to hook it into Blackboard or Moodle, or you could set it up with LDAP, which is going to hook it up into some sort of Active Directory server. Session management, you're probably not going to change, and Facebook integration doesn't work anymore, so you're definitely not going to want to change that, and there you go. We can also look at defaults. I'm just going to go through this one much more quickly, just to show you that defaults has a lot of stuff that's not in local overrides but can still be overridden. It's just when you start overriding stuff that's in defaults, it's maybe not quite as, it's not as intended to be overridden. So if you do override it, you know, things may act differently. You can change how feedback is reported. You can change things about how the achievements look or how the editors look. Really low-level stuff about how PG behaves. You can change pretty much anything if you dig deeply enough. The better you get at WeBWorK, the farther on you're going to get into this file, and you're going to start messing with all sorts of crazy things. All right, so we're going through this. I think that's pretty much as we want to do from this. I recommend you take a look at defaults config sometime just to see what's in here and see how you can mess with it. Notice I'm only 25% through this one, so maybe we're not going to go through the whole thing all at once. All right, so that's pretty good. More config files. Like I said, configuration is a big part of setting up your system. You'll notice we have a lot of WeBWorK.Apache config files. These are configuration files which configure how WeBWorK is interfacing with the Apache server. In fact, right now WeBWorK isn't on. It hasn't been sort of set up and caused to run yet because the Apache server doesn't know about WeBWorK yet. Now, we actually have a bunch of different Apache config files depending on which version of Apache you had. We've got Apache, which is for Apache 1, Apache 2-config, which is for Apache 2, and Apache 2.4-config, which is for Apache 2.4, which has some pretty significant changes from 2. We're going to need to figure out which Apache version we have. This is something that may be different depending on what version of the server you have. Also, I think Apache control works on a lot of the different distributions. So I'm going to do sudo apache control status. So I see a bunch of different stuff about our server. Looks like I've been talking for about an hour, for example. But up here we see server version Apache 2.4.7. You'll notice it's npm event. That's not what we want it to be, but I haven't restarted it since my previous change of event over to prefork. So we need Apache 2.4 as our comp file, so I'm going to copy over WeBWorK.Apache 2.4-config to the corresponding config file. Now, there isn't actually anything you need to change about this file. Everything that you want to know about it is contained in, or everything it needs is contained in other files, but we're going to take a look at it anyway. If you're really a hardcore Apache configuration kind of person, this is where a lot of that stuff goes. Actually, that's not true. We do need to change these two things. So notice I said sometimes things are hard-coded, and if you move them, they might break. Well, this was hard-coded to be opt WeBWorK WeBWorK 2, and it would have had to have been changed to wherever we put WeBWorK if we hadn't put it in the standard place. And there's other stuff like that floating around in different places. So I'm glad I opened this. All right. Now, unfortunately, just putting this file here does not do the things we want it to do. So let us move it to where it needs to go. This is going to vary depending on what kind of server you have. For example, if you're on Yum or Fedora, this is going to be etch HTTPD. For us, it's etch Apache 2. And then the structure of the configuration folders is different. For all of them, the configuration folders work pretty much the same. There are folders. It will read whatever comp files you have in those folders. That's actually a pretty complicated structure. Oh, not that. Not that. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out where my page was. Here we are. So, we can actually see the structure of the configuration files, what it's loading in what order in the configuration overview. In particular, sites enabled is where you put sites that you want Apache to deliver. Except actually it's not in sites enabled, it's in sites available, at least on my machine. So if I go to sites available, I can see some stuff. Right now there's the default configuration, which just sets up the basic server, and an SSL, which is not enabled because we don't have the secure socket layer set up. And we want to add WeBWorK to this, so I'm going to do ln-s. And you'll notice I'm linking it here. I'm not actually copying it here because I want it to pick up any changes I put on it in WeBWorK 2 comp. If I want to be able to change the Apache 2.4 config file in WeBWorK and have those changes reflected here. Oop, I'm not going to be able to do that because Apache is a very deep system thing, so we're going to need sudo in order to do that. And now you can see I've got a WeBWorK config file. It is not currently enabled though, so sudo a2nsite will enable a site, and I'm going to enable WeBWorK. So if I look in sites enabled, WeBWorK is here now. And that's it. I think we can restart it now. I'm looking at my list of things I need to do because you never know. There can be more stuff always that you need to do. But I'm pretty sure this is a big moment of truth. If you have a compilation error or if you have missing files or missing packages, this restart process is going to fail. You're noticing that WeBWorK, now when I start the WeBWorK, the Apache server, it's got a lot of stuff. WeBWorK is spitting out stuff. But it didn't actually fail. It got set up correctly. And so we're up and running, mostly. There's a couple of things we need to do before we're actually up and running. So going back to WeBWorK courses, I need to create the admin course. The course administration page is actually itself a course. It's just a sort of specially branded, specially working course. And I need to make that. I need to set it up. So I'm going to go new group, WW data. That is also a typo on my sheet, which I should change. That's going to change my group that I'm acting as to WW data, so the thing that I'm creating now will be accessible by the web server. Oh, no, I did forget to do something. Well, we'll do that in a moment. Now I'm going to add the course. This is a script. You can add courses via the web page, and a lot of you will. But if you want to create scripts and things, you can actually add courses and manage your WeBWorK courses much more quickly and easily using the command line. But this first course needs to be done here. So you can kind of imagine how this line would look if I had a non-admin course, right? I'd be adding an actual calculus course, and I'd be specifying the class list, and I'd be specifying which user was the professor, and it already, well, curses. It worked. Don't even worry about it. So what's going on here is you'll notice a dbd mysql do failed table already exists. That's because the course was already in the database because I had that old database set lying around MySQL before I started this demo. In theory, this should all still work. If not, what I'd have to do is I'm going to have to go back and blow that whole database away and create a blank one and then delete the admin folder that I made and then redo this process. Will Del course work? It should work everything? Is it just admin? So that worked, and then, okay, so that worked. That is another way around it. That's even better than the one I did. We don't want the admin course to be visible to the outside world because it makes it easier to get into it. And so you can hide courses by having a special hide directory file in there, and that will cause them to vanish. You can still access them, but you have to know what their address is. And another thing I have to do, I'm just going through my list of stuff that the script would do automatically. I'm not actually sure what uses this at the moment, but there is a package chromatic which is used for graphs or something similar in PG. In order for it to run, it needs to have a particular C file compiled. So that's what I'm doing. It's got some warnings. I'm okay with those. We're going to be all right with that. So something I haven't done that I forgot to do and that I need to do now is to change the permissions of everything. So right now, you'll notice that if I go to the WeBWorK folder and I look at the permissions of everything, it's all owned and writable by me, the WW admin user, but nothing's writable by WW data. None of those groups are WW data. And since those groups aren't WW data, the web server is not going to be able to write to those folders. But the web server, it needs to be able to write to some things. It needs to be able to write to courses. It needs to be able to write to some temporary directories and some other various things. So if I go to WeBWorK 2, I'm going to do one long command here. And what I'm doing is I'm changing the group to WW data for all of the folders that really should be able to be accessed by the web server. And you'll notice it's temporary folders, folders that just contain miscellaneous data, the courses folder. These things need to be able to be writable by the web server. Technically, did I get logs? Yeah, and the logs folder needs to be written there. Technically, I've got another command that adds the group writable ability, but because of the way my system is set up, these things are already writable by groups, so I don't have to worry about that. I'm also going to set the sticky bit on all the directories there. The sticky bit has always been a bit of a mystery to me, but it controls who's allowed to delete what in a folder, and it makes it a bit safer. Basically, it's going to set things so that in these folders, the web server cannot delete things that you create, if I understand it correctly. This is the joys of command line stuff. This is one huge long command. What I'm doing is in each of the directories that I've listed here, I'm going through all of those directories in every file, and if the file has type directory, I'm execing a command on it, which is going to add the sticky bit to the group. And so now if I look at these files, you'll notice that something like logs in the middle there is drwx rws r-x. That S is the sticky bit that I set, and logs has group WW data. So that's me setting the permissions. I think there's actually a script that sets permissions for you, or maybe checks permissions, but I wanted to do it. Yeah, set file permissions, but I wanted to do it manually so that we know why things are set the way they are. All right. Now we're really, really close. One last thing we need to do is run OPL update. This is going to build the MySQL database that has information about all the problems in the Open Problem Library. And this is going to take a little while because that number is going to have to go up to about 30,000 or so. And I can answer some questions while it's counting. But I thought I would give people a moment to stare at the numbers counting higher and higher and higher, contemplate the meaning of things. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to test everything to make sure it works, and then if there's time left over, I'm going to start talking about some of the various things we can do to make it safer, make it better, change things, you know, how updating and upgrading works and that kind of stuff. But for now, let us see the fruits of our handiwork. I should have something around here, yes. Boom, boom, boom. There we go. So I will tell you about my suspicion. The Amazon instances, particularly the ones in the free tier, do not have, an excess of memory. I have less than a gig of memory, and I have 160 megabytes free. That is not very much. I can definitely be running out of memory, and the symptom in this case is Apache is being a little bit badly behaved, and it's refusing to start. If I restarted, it would maybe clear some stuff up. Honestly, there is too little RAM for this machine to be doing what I'm doing, even though I'm not running a course. So maybe that gives you an idea of what we need. All right, so I'm at WeBWorK 2. There are no courses. So I'm going to go to admin. That's going to make the admin course. The default user is admin, password admin. You want to keep this user around for precisely 32 seconds because this user is super terrible. It's not a good user. So I'm going to add myself as a user because student ID, I'm going to set to be password. Normally you can put it be whatever your password is. I'm just going to put that as my password. Login name. Oop, that's not my password. Yeah, I'm getting all sorts of weird errors now. Let's see if that works again. Okay, so it added it. I'm going to make sure that Gailey is permission level professor or even admin. And I'm going to delete the admin user because I don't want that user hanging around in my database, allowing whoever and whatnot to come to my site and do whatever they'd like to do. Alternatively, you can just change the name of the admin user. Now, I cannot delete myself. I need to log out from admin, log in as my other user. The song and dance seems silly, but it's important for security. Okay, course administration. Some things we can do. You should definitely register your site. Once you get your site going, you can definitely register it. This will help us keep track of who's using WeBWorK. It helps us, convince people that WeBWorK is current and growing and happy. You notice it's telling me my systems are up to date. This is the GitHub notifier helping me out. I can add a course. And really what I'm doing is I'm trying to check all of the various systems. So this is telling me that the web interface is working, the database is working because it's creating a course, logging in, telling me that authentication is working. I really need to check that the whole problem grading portion is working. So for example, I should import maybe the demo set. So that I can make sure I can import things. This is telling me that set management is working properly. Clicking on demo, I can visit a problem. I could figure out the midpoint of two things if I wasn't in a hurry, so I'm just going to show answers. Check this. All right, so things are working, right? I'm able to grade things. My server is up and running. It hasn't died. It's useful to also check different different display or rendering methods. This is currently the MathJax rendering method. If I go to user settings, I can view equations as images. And now if I go to the demo set, sorry, am I clicking through this too fast, or is it uploading quickly enough? Okay. Okay. You'll notice that these equations are now images. It's a slightly less clean way, but slightly more universal, although MathJax is pretty universal at this point. Yeah, this is much harder on the server. If you're sort of skirting the line with your server, MathJax does all of its rendering on the machine of the person looking at the code, looking at the problem, whereas this is doing all the rendering on the server, and it's much more difficult, serving a lot more files. Yeah, I want to also check the library browser. You'll notice that the library browser is done with its whole process. So I needed to wait till the library browser was done before I could really dive into the browser on here. So I'm going to create a set, and I'm going to make sure that the library browser works. Something to keep in mind, it may seem innocuous, but by changing these subjects, I'm actually testing a whole nother pathway for WeBWorK. These subjects are all done over JavaScript via a different pathway. So by changing these subjects, you're actually testing a whole nother WeBWorK interface, and it will fail a lot of the times. The library browser, the JS part of it, is a little bit fragile. It's pretty good, but you might find that you can't change these things, and that's not some little bug. That means that a particular pathway of WeBWorK is not working. Okay, so I can do stuff. I viewed some files. That's pretty good. I can add them, hopefully. I'm going to test adding them to make sure it works. This says in target set. Do I believe you? I will believe you when I actually see the set. Well, I've got those two files in here. I can render them. Another thing we should do is we should test the hard copy procedure. Hard copies are another pathway. They're using a lot of the LaTeX code that we were looking at earlier. So we definitely want to make sure that works. So in particular, that did not work. So we want to figure out why. Failed to convert text to PDF with command bada. I know why this is happening as well. This is my server running out of RAM. I was having trouble with this before, and it failed in exactly the same place. I could restart my server, and it would probably fix this issue. So why don't I do that, actually? It'll be a good example of stuff. Yeah, so if I do free again, I've got 55 meg of RAM free. That is not enough for this to be healthy. System is going for reboot. I'll have to wait a few minutes, probably not minutes. I might be able to go to my EC2 terminal and see whether or not it's running. No, it just is still running because it's still doing stuff. So I'll just have to wait.
Jeff, when you ran the OPL command, did you use sudo for that?
I did not, and I don't need to.
Okay, so sometimes when since I'm not always the owner of the WWAdmin, I have to use sudo, and that's complicated because then I don't have WeBWorK root and so on set. And so there's a command that's sudo-e, which uses root permissions but my bash file. It's very useful. Sudo-e and then /opl-update.
Okay, so you'll see that this worked. This is a correct hard copy of the set I was looking at, and so we are good to go there. See, looking at my list of things to do, we should probably check the email system if we've set email up. Setting email up is not really optional. This whole email instructor button is one of students' favorite sort of features. It's really important to have around so that they feel like they can ask you questions and get in touch with you. So you really do need to set it up, and you need to make sure it works. But I don't have an SMTP server, and so we're not going to be able to do that here. You would just get the SMTP information from your site administrator and put that in the config file, and then try and send an email and hope that it works. Okay, so I am going to spend the last couple minutes talking about a couple of other things we can do with WeBWorK, just to demonstrate some stuff, demonstrate how things work, you know, what we can change, what we can alter, some things that I think are really useful. For example, one thing that's really useful is to set up SSL. This would be HTTPS. It's probably the single biggest thing you can do to secure your site and to secure your student stuff is to not be running over HTTP. It's actually pretty easy. So we would do sudo apt-get install lib apache mod SSL. No, maybe lib apache 2. Mod. Notice I'm using the tab autocomplete here to sort of half remember something and then hope that I get enough of it. Or I could just look at my notes and figure out what I was supposed to actually type in the first place. Oh, I don't need to. It's already there. And in fact, if I go to etch Apache 2 and I go to mods available and I look here, one of the things I will see is the SSL mod. So all I need to do is sudo a2 nmod ssl dot, just SSL actually. I need to restart my server, but SSL is not something that you just plug and play. In particular, if I go to sites available, you'll remember the default ssl.conf. This is where you set things like your certificates. These certificates identify your server both as, you know, something that's trusted and help clients tell your server apart from other servers which may be trying to impersonate your server. These are snake oil certificates. They're not real certificates. They don't work. They're not secure. They don't actually secure anything. And you need to get certificates from another source. Probably your institution. You can get certificates on your own, but your institution has them and will share them with you. But you have to bug somebody about it. So you'd put the name of those certificates here, wherever you've stored them. Another thing we're going to have to do is redirect traffic so that all of our traffic is redirected to the SSL side of things. So this virtual host 80, this is my standard sort of virtual host. And what I can add in here is redirect permanent, and this is going to redirect everything going to my server to the HTTPS version of my server. But I'm not going to save this because I don't have a URL for it. I suppose I could get that IP address, but I already forgot it. So I would put that in here, and then we would save all this stuff. We would also go to the conf file and change the site.conf file so that the root server URL was HTTPS. It's important to have these things match up with what you're trying to do. So you want this to be HTTPS if you expect everything to be running over HTTPS, or HTTP if you don't have HTTPS enabled. So that's one big modification that I think people would want to see. Another big modification people often ask for is how do they hook to their school's authentication. You know, a lot of what I'm talking about, you're going to have to talk to your administrator, your IT people to help you, but that means that you're integrating your server with your school, and that's better and not worse. There's a lot of different authentication modules we support. The most popular of them is this LDAP authentication module, so I would copy over Authn LTI .conf.dist to athen.lti.conf, and I would edit it. So this is saying permission denied. That is because I am not currently logged in as the WeBWorK administrator. And I have to learn to type. And then I probably need to remove athen.lti.conf because it's going to be owned by the wrong guy, or just copy over a better version. I can't. And it's not LTI. Man, I must be getting toward the end of a 2-hour session. It's LDAP. Too many acronyms. Running out of Mountain Dew. athen.lti.conf. So there's a bunch of things we can set up here. Notice again, we're getting more school-specific stuff. What is your LDAPS server? You know, what's the Active Directory sort of chain that you're searching? Do you have a search account, like a bind account, and does your bind account have a password associated to it? You know, some other things. This failover is a useful variable to know about, in that if you have it set to all, if a username does not match a username in the LDP database, then it will try and use the WeBWorK password system. Sometimes you don't want that to happen. Sometimes you set it to be 0 so that people who don't have accounts with the LDAP server can't log into WeBWorK at all. So you'll have to think about that. Just creating this file does not enable it. To enable it, I would go to localoverrides.conf, and there's an LDAP authentication line here, and I would put include, and that's going to include that whole file into local overrides, and then I would be able to use it. All right, are there any questions? I feel like that's a good time to stop. You can also take a look, now that we've been through stuff, and do the rest of the problems from the breakout session. Try and figure out how to get your own light TTP server set up, or, you know, dig through local overrides and figure out whether or not you can make students not be able to change their passwords.
Jeff, I've got a question. Did you change to HTTPS?
I didn't enable the server.
Okay. One thing is that when you do change to that, did you change the site URL? Okay, because it's important that the site URL, whether it's HTTP or HTTPS, agree with what you're with what you're calling it, because that can sometimes wreck the library browser if they don't agree.
That's true. Right. Yeah, like I said, the library browser, that particular portion is a little bit fragile. We're working on making it more stable and having better error reporting, but if those library browser menus fail, that's something that happens reasonably commonly, and you can check your Apache error logs to figure out what's going on. Actually, that is something I should show you. Your friend, when doing site admin stuff, is the logs. So let's take a tour of the logs available for you. You've got the logs in opt WeBWorK, WeBWorK2 logs. This tells you a lot of stuff. You know, actually, I'm not sure what's in these logs. I haven't looked at them as much. Someone might be able to fill in. The more useful ones are the logs that are in courses. These are very nice because if you go into test course, for example, and you go to logs, you can look at login.log, and it will tell you who's logged in or who's tried to log in and when. If I actually submit an answer to a problem, I don't know if the server is still running. If I actually submit an answer to a problem, that's not going to work. Then we will see that appear in the answer log. And that's really useful for if students claim that they did not do or something happened, or they didn't submit a particular answer, or they did submit a particular answer, and the system just didn't record it or something. You can see the time and the answers that I submitted and what problem I submitted them for, etc. Also useful are the Apache logs. So all of your system logs are kept in var log. So if you're going to be a good WeBWorK or a good system administrator for Linux, you're going to be really familiar with some of these syslog and dmessage, and all of these things are very useful when you're a system administrator. One of the places we go a lot is the Apache 2 log. I can't just cd into the Apache 2 log. I need to you'd be root. So I'm going to switch over to be root, and then I'm going to the Apache 2, and it's got a bunch of other stuff like access log telling me who's been trying to get in, and the coup de grace, the error log, which has all sorts of stuff. You're getting things spit out. It's going to fill up because there are various warnings picked out by, various Perl things. Like, I think all of these /1 is better written as $1 is actually a grep search and replace thing that changed recently in Perl, and we've been doing our best to track down this as we go, but clearly we missed one because you can see a bunch of them. You can also see if the library browser does fail. This is where you're going to go to figure out why it failed. Or if your server doesn't start up, this is where you'll go to figure out why your server doesn't start up and other things. So the logs are the last thing I wanted to talk about. I think I should leave the last 10 minutes or so for questions or comments or things like that.
Very nice. So any questions from anybody?
This is mostly just useful for comparison. This was the URL that was called, and the runtime was 19 seconds to run that problem. Problem 4 was 0.024 seconds. Sorry, it wasn't. And 0.019 seconds. See, it's really pretty fast. So, this is one hit at 10 seconds and 36 hundredths of a second, I think. I'm not sure what the units are, whether these are hundredths of seconds here or seconds. But in any case, you can handle quite a lot of requests one right after another. So being able to do 5 absolutely simultaneously means that you can do 10 within the span of a second or two. So this looks like it was a long problem right here, ISIC test banners. That one took 6 seconds to compile. Sometimes some questions take longer than others. Okay, so that was one course. This is a course in operations research over in the business school. This course right here is one of our summer courses for calculus. And here's the typical times that it takes to render each problem. So you can see there's, hundredths of a second, so half a 0.05 seconds or so. Maybe there's some bigger ones. Here's one that comes close to 1/10 of a second. Here's one at 2/10 of a second. That's pretty good. That must have been a really hard problem. Well, meaning it was hard for WeBWorK to. And notice it tends to be, and okay, so some of these things now, actually now that I take it back, some of these things that are really, really fast, those are just logging in type things. This starts to be more typical of what it takes to render a problem. I was thinking this behaving somewhat quickly. So 2/10 of a second to render that problem. Notice the student tried it several times. And then the third problem was tried. Fourth problem, got that right away. Switching. Okay, so it's interesting to look at. It's mostly useful for a comparative type of thing. You can look at it, what it looks like when there are not a huge number of students using it, and then you can look at it at 3 in the morning or 2 in the morning once everyone's doing their homework, and see whether your system is slowing down. If you see huge variations between how much time it's taking, and in particular, what will usually happen is that the amount of time it takes to render a problem will stay fairly constant until the load gets really heavy, and then it'll suddenly jump. And that's because your the computer is thrashing, meaning it's trying to solve one problem and it gets interrupted, tries to solve the other problem, and transfers all of its code from memory, from RAM onto the disk and back again. And at that point, that's a sign that you've got too many clients for the RAM, or so you either need more RAM or fewer clients, whatever. Or you can just use it as evidence that you want another grant.
Can you show us the command to do that again?
To see this? Yeah, so this is, here's the location. We're in logs. And there's a number of, you can actually see the transaction logs. I have transaction logs stored in this place. Some store them in other places. But these are actually details of every transaction that's taking place. And then you have to look through them by hand. It's a mess. But the information is there if you need it. So the timing log, less or more, either one of those, they do the same thing. We'll take a look at it. And here's another way to look at it if you're doing it in real time. If you do tail and -F for follow, and then timing log. Okay, so now I'm looking at the very end of the timing log, and if somebody is using this thing, every now and then you'll see, or very often, if there are lots of students, you'll see this blip up and you'll see how much time it took to process the last request. You can also use that tail -F command on something like the error log, so that then you're looking at the bottom of the error log, and every time you do something, if there's an error, it'll show up right. Okay. There we go. See, somebody's working on it. Oh, you're okay. See if you can get in. See if Danny can break in here. Actually, you can get in terms of as a guest and run it. It'll show up. So Danny's busy learning calculus here. Practicing calculus.